Okay, so here we are with the apology. What am I saying? It's been a long day. Well, now what we're going to do is to look at the text, and really everything we need for the allegory of the cave is in the first 4 or 5 pages. After that, after those first 5 pages, you get a discussion of the training and education of the philosopher, right? And in the first 4 pages, we get the situation that necessitates the education. And I want to point us to this key fact. This is central. The entire allegory surrounds education. He says, next then, this is the first sentence of Book 7. He says, next then, I said, make an image of our nature in its education and want of education. So the allegory of the cave is an image in our education or our want, our lack of education. This allegory is really a coded way of talking about the process of education and what it, let me put it this way, what education really is and what education really means, and particularly our lack of education. Our existence in the cave as prisoners is a condition in which we lack sufficient or proper education. It is a condition, therefore, of ignorance. The place above the cave, outside the cave, is a condition in which we have been educated, in which we have a certain degree of knowledge. We are not completely ignorant, or maybe as Socrates says, we are now at least aware of our own ignorance. I know that I know nothing. The only thing I have knowledge of is my own ignorance, and there's some people who are not even aware of that. They think they know something, and precisely because they think they know, they are incapable from even raising the question of what is really true, because they've already reached the conclusion about what is true. So their ignorance is actually a barrier to ever attaining the truth. It is only the skeptical person. It is only the person who by definition sees themselves as ignorant that is even going to have the curiosity to ask the question in the first place. And that's why in the last segment I was so concerned to just ask yourself, with our world that we're living in, some examples I gave in our media, which is really about our real world. Question, what is really going on? The shadow is a shadow, is a shadow, is a shadow. It's not the truth. It does point to the truth in some way. Obviously, there's a relationship between the shadow and the reality. But we don't know what it is. And until we can decode the shadow properly, have our kind of interpretive mechanism, we're going to have to take the shadow at face value, which the shadow is just a shadow. Knowledge of our own ignorance. This is perhaps, Socrates says in the Apology, I am not a teacher and I have nothing to teach because I know nothing. Well, he is a teacher, and he has one or maybe two primary tenets of his teaching. The first one is the unexamined life is not worth living. Not worth living. That's a bold statement, right? It's a bold statement. To flip that around, the only life worth living is the examined life. To ask questions, to be curious, right? The second tenet of Socrates' teaching is that one has to know that they do not know. One has to acknowledge that they do not know. That's not easy to do. And there's two problems with why. I had a great, and I would say arrogant, philosophy professor in undergrad. His name was Daniel Dennett. Right? And he's still alive. He's very old, but still alive, and written many very important books dealing with philosophy of mind in particular, and evolution, a neo-Darwinist. And he said in class one day, he said, some thoughts are hard to think. Some thoughts are hard to think. And I honestly can't tell you exactly the context that this was in. I couldn't tell you why I interpreted it this way, but I think this is what he intended based on the conversation we were having. Some thoughts are hard to think, not simply because you lack the information to be able to think a certain thing, but because there are all types of cognitive and emotional barriers to thinking certain things. Right? And I'll tell you first and foremost, from our world, from our times, singing for our time too, the theme of human slavery on planet Earth today, and the notion that young girls, and in some cases very young children, could be used for sex slavery or organ harvesting. Why? Because people can get away with it, and because there's lots of money involved, lots of money involved. And what did they say? John Dillinger say? He was a famous bank robber during the Depression. They said, Mr. Dillinger, why do you rob banks? Why is that your profession? And he said, that's where the money is, right? So why do people do it? Because they can, and because that's what they want, and if they want what they can get what they want it. Donald Trump has repeatedly, and I doubt that the most of the media you've watched has highlighted that he's talked about this, but he has repeatedly said that human sex trafficking is one of the scourges of our time. It's a hidden scourge of our time. He has said, and the numbers, if you go online and research it for 20 minutes, the numbers will bear this out. There are more slaves on the planet today than there ever were in the 17th, in the 18th, in the 19th century. Who turns out to be one of the biggest industries and also connoisseurs of human sex slavery? People in the United States. People in the United States. Trafficked. Very often these kids come from poor third world countries. Maybe we should shut down the border so things like that, people can't come in. Then you ask yourself, who participates in this? How could you even do it? How could you come close to getting away with it? And what kind of person would want to do it? Well, the answer is simple. Somebody powerful, somebody who's got the law somewhat in their back pocket, someone who's corrupted judges, someone who's corrupted the police. Not all judges, not all police, but select people. Right? Powerful people partake in this, and powerful people profit from it. Jeffrey Epstein was involved in human sex trafficking. He was connected with the most powerful people in the world, full stop. And yet, these are the people you see on your screen at night, at 6 o'clock, at 7 o'clock, celebrated as the great humanitarians of planet Earth. Now, think about that. Now, you don't want to think about that. That's the problem. You don't want to think about that. You don't want to think about young people being abused. And you don't want to think about the people that have been celebrated that you, and when I say you, I mean like us in general, right? The public, You don't want to think that the people you've admired and maybe even idolized could possibly be involved in something so absolutely sinister. And this is the moment where you realize morality is not relative. This is the moment when it's children, that it's no longer about left and right. It's no longer about orange man bad, right? It's about kids. And I think for 99.99% of humanity, the buck stops there. But let me tell you, this is a very difficult thing to think about and think through, because there's an innocent reason why it's too difficult to think about. And when this professor, now I come full circle here, when this professor said, some thoughts are hard to think, it wasn't that people were stupid. It wasn't that people don't have facts at their disposal. It's that precisely there are emotional barriers to thinking certain things. But the problem is there's certain things we need to know about. And if this really is a scourge, and if this really involves some of the most elite people in our society, my God, we need to know about it. Because if the media and politicians have been protecting this, wow, if the American people were to find out what was going on in any kind of reasonable detail with strong evidence presented to them, I think people go wild. They'd go wild, right? Okay. So let's just double back again before we get into reading it. This is about education and what it really means. And I'll give you a hint. We all have come to believe that education is just giving you facts and giving you facts. And what you get is facts, not knowledge. You get a bunch of stuff, factoids, that then needs to be regurgitated. Or at best, you're getting trained to go out and work in the workforce and make the economy go and make the GDP go up every year. So we can be viable as a global, economic power and so on and so forth. Right? Or because the government needs taxes. Right? Because they got to waste our money as best as possible. What is education really? What we get from our education a lot of the times is just facts. But what we really need is knowledge. And even maybe more than knowledge, in a sense, is the skill of thinking to even start to really gain knowledge and to judge the world around us properly. That would be called like wisdom or prudence. But his definition of education is going to be so, I think, contrary to what you typically assume of as education. And I don't think it's any accident, because obviously the cave, what keeps us in the cave? What does the cave consist of? What makes the shadows on the wall? Well, it's all those things we've been socialized into, all those things we've been habituated into. And one of those things, in all those things that we've been indoctrinated with. Well, one of those things, of course, is the educational system. Aristotle makes the obvious observation about what education is and what education means. But you know what? This observation is not taught to you. And you should ask yourself why. Is it just because Aristotle's observation is old and out of date or superstitious and from our old Greek and a patriarchal society? Right? Or is what Aristotle say a universal truth based on our nature that's inextricable, and your education doesn't want to acknowledge in a forthright way? Right? He made a basic and profound observation that all education is about, essentially, to use Foucault's word, reproducing the political order and political system. It's not about making you the best human being you can be. It's not really about enlightening you. It's not about empowering you. It's about making good citizens, making human beings who are patriotic, faithful to the order, faithful to the system, right? 1960s and 70s, it was all about the system, and the man was screwing everybody and so on. Making you, let me be critical now, good sheep, good followers, passive, conformist, looking down at the ground instead of out or even up, passing time until the day comes where one gets fleeced, and so on and so forth. Now, an education making good citizens is not a bad thing. In a good regime founded on the right principles, such an education would turn out to be very good. And one of the things you might learn in that regime, in that society, is that this is the function of education to begin with. But what has he just said? And this is in book 8 of the Politics. You go look at it. It's not even that long. I dare you to look at it. I dare you to read something other than what you've been assigned. What has he not described other than precisely that the goal of education is to make us amenable and adapted to the life of the cave? That's exactly, if the cave is society, as in a political community, a more or less closed community in which we live one way of life based on one set of rulers, one set of form of government, one set of laws, and then other people live other ways, and they live in different kinds of caves. They have different decor. They watch different movies on the inside, right? That's the exact point of education. And this is therefore exactly why Plato said the rulers are the educators. I mean, does he say that precisely, exactly in that way in the Republic? I don't think so. But if you read another book, I dare you to read the whole Republic. And to see the way in which the true rulers of any society are the educators, right? Which of course would include parents and all kinds of experiences you have that educate you. What did Plato acknowledge and even as a poetic philosopher, what did he acknowledge? To come again to the shadows of the cave. He acknowledged that the true education, the real education that most people, that everybody received in society was from the poets, from the myths. And what is a poem? And this is why the shadows marry to the myth and the poem perfectly. Poetry is a false representation of the world. It is a representation because it literally represents the world in a written form or in a painting or in a film. We live in an era in which the allegory of the cave is so perfect. And actually, the technology we have that replicate the shadows on the cave is so compelling because of the photographic image that you don't even take it as shadows because it's so real. Right? That's the problem. That's one of the problems. Right? There's a great book called, I think it's The Image by Daniel Bornstein, a historian, kind of popular historian, like doesn't write like academic history, but he's a serious historian. He writes readable books is what I mean. You don't want to read books by heart, with the exception of the good academics. And there's like a little body of them that their books are wonderful, and then there's other people you can use those books as booster seats. So in his book, The Image, it was all about the modern media in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and as it developed in the television format. And he said one of the things that happened with the photographic image of television is just how compellingly real lies were made because they were a photographic image. Think about the difference between a newspaper with text, words, versus an image, right? Words, we all know about words because we all deal with them every day. We deal with other people's speech as part of our existence. And we know that there's a dubious or loose relationship between words and reality. And we develop highly sophisticated skills to be able to navigate and manage those nuances right? Is someone acting hyperbolically? Is someone understating something? Is someone being ironic? It's because we become experts in comparing what's said to what is, right? In this book, The Image, a book I encourage you to read, I dare you to read, he talks about the way in which this image is so compelling that it's hard to, it's so impactful. It has such a grip on your psyche because the visual, uh, 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 aesthetic of a photographic image is just by definition believable, right? And, it's funny because, I grew up in an era where, I think upstairs we may have had a black and white television that my parents just had around, but it wasn't like we lived in the world of black and white television in late 70s and 80s. But we had a black and white television for a period of time, and we also always had a color television, right? But that TV, man, that thing, it might as well been, a campfire. That thing, the image was terrible. It was grainy, and you're flipping the channels. Compared to today's image, what the word is verisimilitude. The image is so believable today, and so crisp, and so vivid with so many details that you can see. Or just think about black and white film and going to color and the palpable reality of that shift. And connected with this Daniel Bornstein makes this point that the way in which modern media lies to you, is to do it through lots of facts. He says, modern media is deceptive in a way that's fundamentally different from simple propaganda. He says, propaganda tells you the lie right down the middle. They appeal to your emotions. To your patriotism, to your fear, and on and on and on. But the media has gotten the 2.0 version of how to manipulate you. They actually appeal to your philosophic impulse. He doesn't use the word philosophic, but this is exactly what we're talking about with Socrates here. We're talking about your impulse to want to know what's really going on in the world. And he says they exploit this impulse by giving you a boatload of facts and images and data, right? Data doesn't mean knowledge. It just means shit. It's knowledge once you know how to interpret the facts, right? In and of themselves, they're totally misleading or meaningless. So media constantly gives you, they don't want to have to lie to you outright, although they have done that. They have blatantly lied and been caught at it and are shameless of it. That's stunning. So, what's the best way to lie? Winston Churchill, in the Second World War, he's the Prime Minister of Great Britain, and he's like the one country in Europe standing up to the Nazi scourge. Really, it was, eventually it was the Soviets, as my Russian wife never fails to remind me. But in Europe, it was the Brits who stood up to the Nazi regime. And he was talking about intelligence and the need to conceal. War, interestingly, turns out to be a lot about deception, not just, armies meeting on battlefields and tanks and planes and all that stuff, right, the way we see it in movies. But it's about intelligence, and he said, when you have one truth that you really need to protect, you surround it by tons and tons of lies, so nobody knows where that truth is. And you protect the truth. I would say what the media does is actually the inverse, which is they have one central lie that they want to penetrate your skull and have it sink into, not even your conscience, into your unconscious, right? The best way to get someone to believe is to have them accept the belief without realizing they're accepting it. So it never goes through the gate of judgment, you might say. And what they do is they take one single central lie that is the linchpin of what they're trying to perpetrate on you and the public, And they surround it with tons of truth that are perfectly accurate, right? You never, every liar knows that you never lie more than you need to, right? So your goal would then be to tell as much truth as possible. And then in the process of giving many, many paragraphs, you slip in one sentence that is the key lie, but the other person, the public, is convinced that you're telling the truth because you have said so many things that are verifiably true, right? These people aren't stupid, right? They may be fake, but they're not stupid. So this is famously known as the Allegory of the Cave. And the word allegory comes from a Greek word. Basically, it's the same word, just it's been transliterated in English. And almost all ancient literature, almost all poetry, almost all religious texts from the ancient world function in the mode of allegory. They're not interested in telling you the truth directly, right? This image of the cave is really about us. But Plato doesn't sit there didactically and moralistically and say, hey, you, wake up from your dogmatic slumbers. It's time to get woke, yo. It's time to get woke. If he does that, you're going to be so turned off, you're going to say, you're a condescending jerk, Plato. So what he does is he cloaks his story in the fabric of this bizarre situation of people living in a cave and chained. You look at yourself and say, I'm not a slave. I'm not enchained. I'm free, right? I'm free, right? So if he just said, this is you, I mean, actually he does say these people are us, right? At a certain point he's got to say that. Why do they speak this way? So an allegory is speaking figuratively in a non-literal way. So it's a myth. It's a figurative treatment of an unmentioned subject under the guise of something similar to it in some way. It's a symbolic appearance pointing to a literal reality. It's a description of one thing under the image of another. Literally, the word literally means speaking about something else or speaking in another way. Speaking in an obscure or cryptic or esoteric or one of my favorite words, elliptical. And if you don't know what it means to speak in an elliptical way, I dare you to look the word up. God forbid you look up a word. Not forthright, speaking with a hidden meaning. Let's look at the root of the word. Allos, meaning another or different, and agoren is derived from the word agora. Agora is the marketplace and the assembly area of ancient Greece, ancient Athens. It's where people went to speak publicly and voice their concerns directly to each other publicly without concealing what's on their mind, right? To speak another way from the way people speak openly in the agora is to speak in a coded way. All right, that's all pretty clear. So then the question becomes why? You tell me, think. What is the value of purposely telling a story in a coded way? Well, I think the first answer is to compel you to think. Plato has his character and hero Socrates repeatedly say things like, can virtue be taught? Can knowledge, can wisdom be taught another person? And Socrates' basic answer is no. That people have to arrive at conclusions on their own. I know what I know from my point of view, and this is how I came to know what I know. But you can't be me, and I can't be you. I can't just, we can't have a Vulcan mind meld of transference of information. And even if we could, it wouldn't mean anything, because you have to experience it. The only way you can truly understand is to figure it out for yourself. So I think that's one, perhaps maybe the most important reason as to why he speaks in code or in allegory, right? For you to take ownership, for you to discover the curiosity, for you to reach the conclusions on your own, so they're yours. When the conclusions aren't yours, they don't mean the same thing. for a lot of different reasons. But also just for kind of selfish reasons. Like when you think of it yourself, like, you're like, that's my idea. I really understand it, right? But there's another reason, right? Which is that if we had our world presented directly to us, we wouldn't be able to see it properly because we're a victim of the shadows. And because we're a victim of our own interests and our own emotions and our own biases and our own self-protectiveness, right? And so what this allows to do is to come at issues of our life obliquely, like from the sense of, oh, this story is not really about us, is it? Look at these people in the cave. Oh, these pitiable people. Oh, wait a second. That is like me. That's just like me, in fact. It allows us to think we're thinking about a third party or a second party, when in fact we're actually thinking about ourselves. And I think a pretty good example of this, one of my favorite examples, is the original Star Trek show, which of course, and many sci-fi shows are like this. So if you are into sci-fi, which I'm not really, but I was really always loved Star Trek. That show was set, like 400 years from now, out in space, and the galactic voyagers, and, they were like the UN of space and stuff like that. And ironically, the issues that came up in that show, the social issues, the political issues, the moral issues, were all issues that were really straight out of the time period. This show was made in the late 60s and early 70s for, I guess it was like 3 years or so. And they found a coded way of talking about us so that we could ruminate and look at ourselves without being fully aware that we're looking at ourselves. And by not feeling like we're looking at the mirror, but instead looking at someone else, it's much easier to judge, right? Much easier to judge. So let's read. Next then, I said, make an image of our nature in its education and want of education, likening it to a condition of the following kind. So our education or lack of education, our state of awareness or knowledge or our ignorance is akin, is similar to this situation. Now this word like, right? This establishes the allegory. This establishes the relationship between our actual condition and this poetic depiction, right? And therefore the poetic depiction is not going to mean anything if we just take it at face value. It is a shadow itself that is in need of interpretation. So what does the shadow of the cave look like? To say it's the allegory of the cave is a poetic myth. It is itself a shadow. We're just reading words on the page, right? Until we connect it to our actual world. It's just a cute story, It's just a cute story. See human beings as though they were in an underground cave, like dwelling with its entrance, a long one, open to the light across the whole width of the cave. They are in it from childhood, with their legs and necks bound so that they are fixed, seeing only in front of them, unable, because of the bond, to turn their heads all the way around. So they've been there since childhood, which is to say this is what they know. They don't have any alternative perspective. Since childhood, this also suggests like a period of formal education. It's contemporaneous with that. And then they're shackled. They are slaves. They are prisoners. Their bodies are shackled. But what are we really talking about? The body here is a metaphor for the mind. Because what you really are for Plato and Aristotle and the Greeks is a mind, a soul, I should say. Soul has passions. Mind, it's not broad. Soul is the right word. Their souls are shackled, and and they're enslaved to their own lack of awareness, and it's the lack of awareness precisely that enslaves them and keeps them there. in a sense, they're not external shackles at all. If you've seen, this is a great analogy, if you've seen One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, there were like the terminals who were committed on the second floor that were the people that McMurphy was in with. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, go read the book. Go watch the movie. Do something. Do something. Right? And McMurphy, he committed a crime, right? He's kind of like a rebellious criminal, not terribly serious crime. And I guess he pleaded that he was crazy, or he pleaded his case, and instead of getting thrown in jail, he got thrown in a mental institution. And he shows all the people in the mental institution a great time, and he's rebellious, and he gives them a kind of fighting spirit when they've all been very passive. And, maybe months of having been in this institution, he's sitting down with all these men and asking them, about why they're committed and all this stuff. And guess what he discovers? He discovers that they're all there under their own volition. They have chosen to be in a place that he is only there because he is forced to be there. And he's shocked. And he's appalled that these guys have, these other characters, have such a lack of will, such a lack of spirit and courage, that they've just kind of passively accepted this condition. Right? And many of these people, their issues are not terribly, terribly serious. Right? It's like, at least that's the way it's presented in the film. Anyway, so these chained people in the cave, in a sense, they're shackled by themselves. And yes, society contributes, but at some point you have to attribute, how did anybody ever liberate themselves? Do they always need a teacher, right? Who's the person who's really going to liberate these people? It's a teacher, right? Which just means someone who shows something, that there's something different. It doesn't mean necessarily the formal sense of a teacher in the classroom with, kinds of pedigrees and, degrees hanging on the wall and, a stuffy attitude. Right? Last thing here. They cannot turn their heads. They cannot turn their heads. This is perhaps the most important point here, because there's two ways to think about the shadows on the wall. On one hand, they are the moral, political, religious opinions of society that are generated by the ruling class and projected and promoted by their propaganda. Let's just call it that. On the other hand, the shadows are empirical reality itself. The world that comes to us, the data that comes to us, the sensory stimuli that comes through our senses. So there's two liberations that are actually occurring when we get out of the cave. One is a liberation from the false beliefs of the system, the political, the religious system, the cultural system. But the other is actually a cognitive liberation from the material world as being the only and ultimate and final reality. Plato, where does he really stand? Who knows? But the typical interpretation of Plato is that he believes in a supersensible world beyond the appearances of the world, and that the true reality of things and also the source of all the appearances is beyond what appears to us, to our eyes, right? And that to really understand the true nature of reality, we need to take in the data from primarily our eyes, because the sense of sight is really the primary element here, although they do hear things as well, right? And that's not unimportant. Speech and sight, right? We hear speech and we see things happen. But that true reality can be discovered through not the eyes, but the mind's eye, working on the data that comes in from the eyes. That the mind's eye can infer from what we see something more than just what's there, a kind of pattern of, or the order of things, the true nature of things, however you want to conceive of it, right? For a Christian, it's very simple. Like all the fleeting stuff we see, this is all really just an emanation of God. And God is the single principle. In this myth, it's not God, it's the sun, right? And the sun is kind of presented as the ultimate God here, it seems. Okay. Turning their head. They're turning their eyes. But what they're also doing is turning their mind's eye from the sensible world to the suprasensible world. And yet, of course, in the myth, it's all presented as a physical reality. But of course, that physical reality needs to be interpreted, because the body of people enchained is really not about a body being enchained or enslaved. It's about a mind or a soul. Right? Their light is from a fire burning far above and behind them. Behind the fire and the prisoners there is a road above, along which we see a wall built like the partitions puppet handlers set up in front of the human beings, and over which they show the puppets. I see, he said. This is a person Socrates is talking to. Then also see along this wall human beings carrying all sorts of artifacts. Artifacts. So we learn a couple other important things. The light that creates the shadows is man-made. The objects that cast the shadows are man-made. All along, the slaves or prisoners are viewing these shadows and the light and the shadow and everything as a natural phenomena, that it comes from nature. I'll give you an example. Here's a great one, because you'll all accept this. Pagan religion tells you to believe in Zeus, believe in Poseidon, believe in Athena, believe in Hera, believe in Apollo, believe in the existence of Mount Olympus, where Zeus is king of men and gods and father of men and gods, right? And you were born and you believed all this to be literally true. Ooh, Mount Olympus. And then one day, someone came along and told you that these were not naturally occurring phenomena. And by natural, the gods being natural means like somebody didn't make them. They just exist. As the order of the cosmos, they have come to exist. And someone comes along one day and says, excuse me, man, Santa Claus ain't real. A human being came up with the idea of Santa Claus. He's a cognitive or mental artifact of somebody's mind. Right? Santa Claus isn't a human being. He's just that stuffed animal that your daughter takes to bed at night. That's all he is. He's no more or less real than that stuffed animal. Right? Is a human being, for example. Right? So then imagine, you believe in God or some God, and it's real. The God is the creator of all things, or some such. And then someone come on and tell you, not only is God, not real in the way you think, but he was invented by people to control your understanding of things, or what have you. Right? He says, they are like us, I said. For in the first place, do you suppose such men would have seen anything of themselves and one another other than the shadows cast by the fire on the side of the cave facing them? So they are like us. Now, the word like. They are like us because this is a myth, right? The myth is like us, therefore the myth is like our situation of our want of education. Therefore, the prisoners are like us as a kind of analog in this myth. But let's be clear. These people are us. They're not like us. They are us, right? It's just that we're not literally in a cave chained up. And so the next point he makes is that How could they think anything different other than accepting the reality of the shadows? They have no other point of reference. No other point of reference. They have no, even if they had some kind of skeptical mindset, they would have no reason to be skeptical about these shadows. He says, how could they have any other point of view if, and I'm adding a couple of words there, but at the top of the page here, how could they have any other point of view if they've been compelled to keep their heads motionless throughout their life? This is why turning the head is so important, because when you turn the head, you get a different perspective on what's going on the wall, and also you learn more about the context in which these shadows are being created, right? Because when you're looking, it's just like looking at a movie theater. It marks out this narrow section of your visual field and of everything else around you, 360 degrees. And the movie essentially says to you, for these 2 hours, this is reality. This little section of actually what's a small section of the larger reality, right? And you laugh and you cry and you find that you like, oh yeah, that character is so cute, its personality is so great. And meanwhile, you've just been watching flickering light for 2 hours. I mean, who does that? Who does that? And you think it's entertainment, right? It's just entertainment. I have a note on that in a moment. He says, and what about the things that are carried by? Carried by. Isn't it the same with them? Of course. If they were able to discuss things with one another, don't you believe they would hold that they are naming these things going by before them that they see? Necessarily. And what if the prison also had an echo from the side facing them? Whenever one of these men passing by happens to utter a sound, do you suppose they would believe that anything other than the passing shadow was uttering the sound? No, by Zeus, he said, I don't. So the shadows are like mouthpieces. It's Oz, Wizard of Oz, in which, a person stands behind the wizard and he's really just a little runt and so on. But they don't even know where the content is coming from. And when they look at the shadows, what do? He talks about naming, but more generally, they talk about them, right? They talk about them. So we see the world, and we talk about it. And if we see an illusion, and we don't know any better that's an illusion, we still talk about it. And we build up a whole repertoire of thinking about that falsehood. And actually, it's only going to reinforce the falsehood, right? No, by Zeus, he said, I don't. Then most certainly, I said, such men would hold that the truth is nothing other than the shadows of artificial things. Now, in the Symposium, Socrates, basically in a riff on it, reiterates that the only thing he has knowledge of is his own ignorance. And in the Symposium, he says, my wisdom is but a shadow in a dream. My wisdom is but a shadow in a dream. Right? And obviously that has a very powerful and direct echo of what we're reading here. The point is, a shadow in a dream is several steps removed from reality. The dream is already an illusory image, and the shadow is a projection of a real object, but the real object is just in the dream, right? So it's not it's a dream object, I should say, but the dream object is then based on, some reference to something you've actually seen, right? And of course, this dream is very significant in The Matrix. We saw that little clip in which you're dreaming. How do you know the distinction between a waking and sleeping and say dreaming state? Like what is the criteria by which you definitively conclude that you can tell the difference between one or the other? This is a question Descartes asked. So when you see it in The Matrix, this question has a long history. And it probably goes back to ancient, Hellenistic philosophy, when they were doing hardcore skepticism about the nature of things and questioning the most fundamental things that we tend to take for granted. But the cave is the same thing here. If you're locked into this position, the dream is going to be reality. And how would you ever tell the difference? And so the shadows of artificial things. So artificial things are man-made things, and they're representations of naturally occurring things. So they're already one step removed from the natural world, and then they are projection shadows of artificial things. So we're 2 levels away from the real world when we see, and think about it, it's very clear, right? So when they get liberated, the first thing they're going to be able to do is to see the artificial objects and the men carrying them, the man behind the curtain, the Wizard of Oz, right? And then they're going to be able to go outside and see the true source of things. So you've got this distinction between the man-made fire and the sun, on the other hand. So then he talks about this, right? And we'll just go to, this image here. This is a nice image. It says 2 things in leaving and entering the cave. When you start to turn your head, it's painful, it's difficult. It's a shock. Can you imagine the shock if you really take this seriously? And the challenge of leaving the cave. At the bottom of page 194, it's described as this steep, hard journey, right? And this is a cognitive journey, right? This is a cognitive journey to start to accept that what you've seen is not true, and to accept what you are seeing now as true, right? Neo, when he first goes through his experience, he has no clue what's going on, right? He says, is this real? Man, this can't be real. And Morpheus goes, well, is it? Right? So they are disoriented, right? And the disorientation is done in the metaphor of the disorientation of the eyes, because they've been looking at shadows. Their eyes have been used to seeing the shadows. Then they look at the fire, and it's bright, and they're dazzled, and they're disoriented. Then they go out of the cave and see the sun, and they've been cave dwellers, and they're literally blinded for a period of time. But this really has to do not with the eyes, but with the mind's eye, the shock and awe of discovering the truth of something, right? So then it happens that people who have finally liberated themselves, when they come back, they're disoriented because their eyes are now adjusting to the dark. But to say it's adjusting to the dark is what they're really saying. They're having to, after having seen the truth, adjust to a context in which the lies and the myths rule, and a context in which everyone in the cave accepts the lies as real. And who looks ridiculous? There's one of them and many of them, and the one person who's come back in and many in the cave. The person who's coming back in looks ridiculous. The person who knows the truth is precisely the person who is not conforming to society's expectations. This is the person who is not politically correct. This is the person who gets banned from Twitter for saying something that's not appropriate. And I don't mean saying something rude or cruel. I'm saying not towing the party line, right? And the cave is society. No human being wants to live outside society. Nobody was destined to live outside society. So while you cognitively leave society, you don't physically leave society, you have to also cognitively return. You have to negotiate. You have to adjust. You have to manage the beliefs of society. And you can't just go running up to everyone and saying Santa Claus ain't real, right? Try that on people. But not about Santa Claus, about serious beliefs, right? No. Not going to happen. And so, let's just make a few more observations about what we see here, right? The long, hard road is the cognitive journey to try to come to terms with the fact that the things you see on the cave wall are you, in the sense that they have made you who you are. Why would you want to disbelieve what has become the essence of you, right? That is a thought that is difficult to think, right? And, clearly Plato sees that this is the fundamental model of rule in society with these characters casting these shadows. This is the dominant thing they do, and keep the minds of society enslaved to one degree or another. And of course, it's not going to be about everything. It's just going to be about the key things that they need to have believed, right? There's a great line from William Casey, who was the CIA director, and he said this apparently in the 1980s. He says, "Our goal will be achieved when everything the American people believe about what's going on in the world in politics, everything the American people believe is not true." Right? Think about that. Think about that. Okay. What in our society today does this? Well, it's the mainstream media. Perhaps many of you probably know that in the 1970s there was a big Senate committee investigation into the goings-on within the CIA. And they discovered that the CIA was involved in planting CIA assets into the media, one, or two, paying certain reputable journalists, very reputable journalists, like the people on the evening news that you saw every night, and they said, "Good evening, that's the way it is in the world today," right? That's just the way it is. And it's not just the way it is, it was what they were paid to say. It was called Operation Mockingbird. And you can read about it in government documents that have been released in the past 20, 30 years. And also there is a great article by Carl Bernstein of Woodward and Bernstein fame, breaking the Watergate story, talking about how the CIA had numerous assets for decades in our media. Right? Many claims have been made about Hollywood. Right? Hollywood. Do you think our government controls the content of Hollywood? Right? Our government, or at least parts of our government, would never be at war with the American people. They're there to protect us, right? So let me just mention this. You see, I've given you the IP address above, the internet address, and that is cia.gov, right? Only the domain .gov domain name is only for government institutions. It can only be used by them. The CIA.gov is the CIA website. Yes, they have a website with all kinds of interesting stuff on it that they've released over the years. And here is something that they released. I don't even know when. It's not important. It's just the title is important. The Nature of Psychological Warfare. The Nature of Psychological Warfare. The abbreviation is PSYOPs. PSYOPs, Psychological Warfare. So like, in Iraq, in Desert Storm 1, I don't know, they used to play like rock and roll to try to freak people out, or there's all kinds of funny and bizarre strategies, and they seem funny, bizarre strategies for breaking people down psychologically to get them to, basically do what you want. I mean, that's really to get the upper hand, right? Psychological warfare. So here is a document released by the government, and you can find it yourself, and I can post it for you, that was originally written, get this, in 1943, in the midst of the war. And I suppose we could say, oh yeah, in the olden days they did that, but they would never do that anymore because we've progressed and we're liberated and we're in a more just society than 1943. But look at the title. This comes from our government. The OSS was the original organization that then later became the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency. What is the title of this document? It is The Motion Picture as a Weapon of Psychological Warfare. And if you think this is gobbledygook, look it up. It's not. This is a government document that was declassified. And you say, why would the government ever put something out there like this? Well, let's just clarify. The motion picture as a weapon of psychological warfare. What motion picture do you think they're talking about? Do you think they're talking about the ones made in Hollywood? Do you think that means that the OSS and then later the CIA were influencing content in Hollywood? Psychological warfare? Warfare uses weapons, psychological weapons. The movie is a weapon. Who is the weapon being used against? It's not being used against the American people, is it? Why would the government ever release this? Well, I mean, I'll tell you why. Because the immediate response of the average person is, the government doesn't do this. People, we live in a free country. They don't do these kinds of things, right? So, you see here very clearly what's their objective. To exploit the potentials of the movie motion picture as a weapon of psychological warfare for the United States. Let's just read. The most powerful shadow we have on our cave wall right now is, well, I'm not sure it's the movie anymore. Actually, I think in our lifetime, the movie is now being displaced by the internet and other modes of content creation and carrying. But let me tell you, when I was a kid, the movie was still king. There was still something magical about going to a movie, and it was a social ritual to go on a Friday or a Saturday night with a family or friends, and you knew that the movie you were seeing, millions and millions of people were also seeing across the country. This common experience. It says potentialities. The motion picture is one of the most powerful propaganda weapons at the disposal of the United States. It can serve many diversified functions. Motion pictures are an unparalleled instructional medium. And on and on. You get the idea. Now, what makes the motion picture perhaps one of the most effective instructional media? I'll give you the simple answer. When you walk in there on the Friday night, or when you sit in front of your TV on the Friday night with the Netflix or the Hulu or whatever it is, you're not getting instruction. You're not getting psychological warfare. You're getting what? Entertainment. Of course. I need to relax from a long day. And of course we do, right? That's the problem. And movies are good for it. And this is why it's so perfect, because it's the word is subliminal and subconscious. Subliminal and subconscious, like they have all this fancy kind of rigmarole sound to them. But subliminal messaging is actually really simple. And subliminal messaging consists of this. There's a dominant thing in the message or in the film or in the radio or the news, whatever it is, that you pay attention to. But there's another thing that you're not consciously attending to, but that is being perceived and picked up by your brain. And that is going into your brain without you being aware of it. And precisely since you're not aware of it, your editorial or your judgment, your gating mechanism is not functioning, and it's just going in there. And of course, many studies have been done on this. You can read books about it, and so on and so forth. So you go in thinking you're getting entertainment, and in fact, and who knows what fact in that movie is the fact that they want to put over on you as the shadow on the cave. But that makes it even more harder to discern because you don't know which one it is, because you can't tell fact from fiction, literally. So we conclude, after the people, a group of people anyway, some minority of the cave prisoners have liberated themselves, the cave prison population. They've seen the sun, their eyes have adjusted, then they've come back down and they've had to been forced to reacclimate and deal with all. They have to accept the lies as true within the cave because they need to function with other people. They can't. Maybe this is why Socrates was ironic. And then here we get an explanation of what education really is. It says then if it is true, if this is true, I say we must hold the following about these things. Education is not what the professions of certain men assert it to be. They presumably assert that they put into the soul knowledge that isn't in it, as though they were putting sight into blind eyes. They claim that education is putting knowledge into the soul that isn't there, just as if they were putting sight into blind eyes. We think education is downloading facts. Here are the facts, students. Give it back to me in a month on the exam. Right? Plato says this is not what education is. In fact, that's more like what indoctrination is. Right? And not only that, facts are just facts. The question is, what do they really mean? And you need to have the interpretive skills to be able to discern what they mean. He says, yes, he said, they do indeed assert that. But the present argument, and notice when he talks, has he been making an argument? No, he's been painting a picture of the cave. The allegory of the cave is actually an argument, his claim about what our true circumstances are cognitively in the world. It says, on the other hand, I said, indicates that this power is in the soul of each. So the power of knowledge is in us already, right? It's not put into us externally, but we have to activate that potential. And that the instrument with which each learns, just as an eye, is not able to turn toward the light from the dark without the whole body, must be turned around from that which is coming into being together with the whole soul until it is able to endure looking at that which is. Now notice his distinction here. Knowledge and education is the process of turning from that which is coming into being to seeing and understanding that which is. For Plato, that which is coming into being is appearance, and that which is reality. That which is coming into being is constantly fluctuating and changing. That which is always and ever the same. For Socrates, for Plato, knowledge is knowledge of what is ever and always the same. Knowledge of nature, right? The essence of things. Things that come into being are constantly changing. They're in flux, and that's what facts are. The light switch is on, the light switch is off, the light switch is on, the light switch is off, right? The truth of the thing constantly changes. It's not really a kind of ultimate truth. The point is, what education really consists of is the turning from the fleeting images to something more permanent and more fixed, right? Moving from, say, the empirical facts of history to simply the way people are, what they are like, what human nature is individually and collectively, and seeing the empirical facts not as specific facts of the past, for example, but as representing more timeless truths about the nature of the order of things and what things are like. And what is this allegory exactly? sing for our time too. It is not simply an artifact of the past. It is not simply a trite belief of an ancient philosopher or a Greek or a guy. It is, I think, or attempts to be, representative of a fundamental truth of human nature or our human condition.